I hate August, it is too hot out here. Time to cool down with some Coldwave. A lesser-known genre of goth, Coldwave has massively increased in popularity since its inception in the late 70s and early 80s. And since y'all enjoyed my death rock video, I thought we could explore another genre that really doesn't get enough love. So hello, I'm Miko and welcome to my channel where I talk about gothy things and just things I like. And I will be your guide through this spooky glacier we call Coldwave. I'd also like to shout out my buddy Stickman, who helped with the more French side of things, truly a real one. Coldwave is a loosely defined music genre that emerged in Europe in the late 1970s, characterized by its detached lyrical tone, use of early electronic musical instruments, and a minimalist approach and style. Coldwave is loosely derived from New Wave. It was popular predominantly in continental Europe and consisted largely of bands that were heavily influenced by post-punk and darkwave. Specifically, Kraftwerk, a pioneer of the genre, Martin Hannett's distinctive production of Joy Division's Unknown Pleasures, and The Cure's A Forest, which set the cold, despondent mood of the genre. Furthermore, the advent of affordable synthesizers and recording devices allowed bands to begin experimenting with new sounds. They drew influence from the tense political climate formed by the Cold War, which led to the genre inheriting punk's musically decisive DIY aesthetic, but sounded more controlled, colder, and usually featured emotionless, detached vocal delivery. This style of vocal delivery was heavily inspired by Susie and the Banshees, as their lyrics evolved from the sparky, upbeat punks they had originated as, although with very gloomy themes, into their final form of more gloomy, somber music. Peep Show is, in my opinion, the most Coldwave style album of theirs. Though synthesizers are commonly used in Coldwave, it focuses heavily on the rhythm section of the musical spectrum, making it very different from its influences. Using a metoric bass guitar and drums that use prolonged reverb using the timpani of the drums rather than the hi-hat, and chorus guitar effects, it creates a droning, somber sound. Deep voices and distorted vocals, while not required of the genre, are also commonly found in the music. This is due to the sad nature of the lyrics, cold, if you will. A low voice tends to lend itself better to the effect of a cold and despondent atmosphere. In an interview with The Quietus in 2010, Peter Schulworth, painter and owner of Weird Records, spelt W-I-E-R-D, dispelled Coldwave's often shallow connotations. The word cold is quite complex in describing this music, for apart from the sounds, as an adjective, it, more importantly, has always suggested to me more of the artist's fragile emotional states while producing it, and the accordant fact that it sounds so direct and unmediated in production, it's very private and humanly warm through its metallic, icy sounds. The term Coldwave appeared in the 26th of November 1977 issue of the UK weekly music paper called Sounds. The caption of its cover picture showing Kraftwerk's Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider was New Music, the Cold Wave. Using this term, a new scene of French, Belgian, and Polish musicians emerged between the late 70s and early 80s. As you must remember, goth was not yet a term used to describe the music, so many different names were used. The Polish scene was also known as Zimna Fala, and the French scene was also known as La Vague Froide, which was a term coined by the French music press to describe the sound of the band Marquis de Sade. Polish Coldwave bands such as Siekierka were more directly influenced by guitar-driven post-punk music, like the aforementioned Susie and the Banshees and even Bauhaus, while French and Belgian artists such as Claire Obscure and Siglo XX incorporated more synths and electronics and crossed over heavily with minimal synth, citing their influences as Joywave and The Cure. But this brings us to the topic of regionality in Coldwave. Goth and post-punk were called Coldwave in the Eastern Bloc instead of goth back in the 80s. And do remember that goths did not like being called goth back in the 80s. Hello, Editing Miko here. I would also like to mention that I do not refer to the eastern part of Europe as the Eastern Bloc to be offensive here. Unfortunately, due to Russia overtaking these eastern regions in World War II, these regions had a separation from the western side of Europe where post-punk was being made, and thus this also contributed to why the Cold War was such a factor in the influence of this music and its style, and just its lyrical contents in general. And this also contributed to Coldwave not being able to spread as far as it could have due to just the separation of area. The Berlin Wall didn't come down until 1989, and Coldwave's inception was in the late 70s and 80s. So this is also why we see a lot of modern Coldwave coming from these regions. And in terms of France, when I talk about France, France is just being France. So there's nothing special there. Thank you. Anywhere else, bands like Sia Kira would have been put in the same category as the post-punk bands they drew inspiration from. This separated these songs and musicians from the overarching term Goth, which was increasingly being used in the US and the UK to describe the developing subculture. This, alongside the alternate genre names, led to Coldwave becoming even more obscure. In these eastern regions, the sound of post-punk was considered Coldwave, which solidified Coldwave's position in the goth subculture outside of these countries. Unfortunately, Coldwave from the Eastern Bloc never reached the commercial heights of the UK synth-pop explosion, but some notable favorites of mine from this time are Opera den Nuit, Tresame 21, and Made in Poland. Coldwave declined in popularity through the 1990s. However, the early to mid-2000s saw a renewed interest in the genre. This renewed interest also saw an emergence of a new retrospective term, minimal wave. Minimal wave groups together aesthetically similar genres such as minimal synth and more minimal types of post-punk, synth-pop, and new wave, also sometimes crossing over with Coldwave. Weird Records is credited with establishing interest in the style in the US, while the Liberty Snake Club did much to popularize it within the UK. The Tiger Sushi Records compilation So Young But So Cold and the compilation Cold Waves and Minimal Electronics, published in 2010, were both influential in re-establishing interest within the genre. In a review from Pitchfork.com, the album Cold Waves and Minimal Electronics is described as Cold Waves is not the first minimal synth retrospective, though it certainly stands as one of the best and most accessible. And accessibility is important to mention here, as the sheer amount of Coldwave bands that cropped up in Europe made the genre difficult to pinpoint, especially since many bands opted to sing in their native languages. Yet, the Coldwaves compilation album managed to keep a cohesive sound, increasing the range of the genre and firmly establishing its gothic sound. With bands like Lebanon Hanover, established in 2010, and Cellophane in 2011, the Coldwave resurgence was riding alongside the post-punk resurgence of the 2010s. Part of this resurgence was fueled by non-goth bands experimenting with the sounds of the 80s as the decade came back into fashion. In the mid to late 2000s, we started seeing the early building blocks of the current post-punk and goth/wave movement, especially the synthwave and retrowave genres, which replicated the 80s music or remixed songs from the 80s. They often pulled from Japanese future pop as inspiration, but also looked to the UK's synth pop explosion for more inspiration, drawing from bands such as Duran Duran, Flock of Seagulls, and Depeche Mode. Alongside this new wave of Coldwave, developed a more guitar-based punk version of the genre, specifically in France known as Cold Oi, and I wanted to mention this genre because it is a great example of how Coldwave resurged and became influential throughout subcultures, and how incredibly diverse and versatile the genre is. With Cold Oi bands like Rancour, Syndrome 81, and Chain Cult incorporating droning synths and distorted guitars into their punk-infused sound, both genres explore deeper, despondent feelings and use a lot of reverb, drawing from the rhythm-based sounds of Coldwave music. However, Cold Oi incorporates more of the reverb into guitar, while the 2010s version of Coldwave, which developed, incorporates more synth. Rancour's lyrics about loneliness and heartbreaking decisions are similar in theme to Lebanon Hanover's lyrics of feelings of rejection, and they do perform with a noose around their neck, which is extremely punk if you ask me. These themes of music are a much better example of crossover versus comparing Coldwave to a genre like Darkwave, which, while it contains very similar synth sounds, it is much more mystic and romantic in lyricism. The spread of Coldwave's influence rippled throughout Europe and the US as we saw more bands emerge throughout the late 2010s. Coldwave continued to slowly grow in popularity due to certain political events, including the spring of 2016 recession in the United States. As people became more despondent and, stressed, it created the perfect storm to open up people's ears to Coldwave. Most popularly, Twin Tribes, Forever Grey, and Molchat Doma. Each musician's unique sound allowed them to skyrocket in popularity, but none more so than Molchat Doma. And we can thank the virality of TikTok for that. Their song Sudo was played in many TikTok memes, without the meme creator understanding the complexities behind their lyrics. But this really isn't a bad thing. I saw Molchat Doma live earlier this year, and it was beautiful to see a wide variety of people come out to support the band on their tour. With the rise in popularity, Molchat Doma has also influenced people to listen to other Russian or Belarusian Coldwave bands like Volny and Peremotka. Having a gateway to these other Coldwave bands is great because it can lead more people to the inspiration behind the sound, to post-punk, to darkwave, and ultimately lead them to Goth. And Goth is currently more popular, or at least visually, than it has ever been. And some people will say that's good, and some will say it's bad, but if it gives us more Coldwave music, I'm pretty okay with it. As per usual, please leave your experiences with Coldwave in the comments. I do a lot of research for these videos, however, the Goth subculture is mostly archived in experiences and not in historical papers. Also, leave some of your favorite bands below, and have a nice day.